With the 2020 campaign season upon us, we're starting to see more and more criticisms of Bernie Sanders surface, and some of these criticisms are resurfacing. They're the same things that was said about Bernie Sanders in 2016. And Mehdi Hasan of The Intercept decided to write an article wherein he responds to each of these main criticisms. Now, there are 5 in total. The first is that he's currently behind in the polls. This is a new one. Also, he's too white, he's too old, he isn't a Democrat, and he's a socialist. So the question is, how do we respond to each of these criticisms in a way that's effective? Well, this is what Mehdi says. When it comes to Bernie Sanders being behind in the polls, Mehdi explains that it is currently the case that Joe Biden has been leading in early polls, with Bernie coming in a distant second and Beto coming in a close third. But Mehdi makes the point that, are the polls really relevant at this stage? The election is 23 months away, and none of the main runners and riders have formally announced that they're even running yet. For comparison, guess who came top in a CNN survey of potential Republican presidential candidates in December 2014, 23 months before the 2016 election? It was Jeb Bush at 24% with a double-digit lead over his nearest rival, Chris Christie. Ted Cruz, who would end up coming in second in the 2016 GOP primaries, was 8th place with 4%. Donald Trump's name didn't even make the list. Now, I actually would agree with him here for the most part, because at this point in time, when nobody's campaigned, when we haven't seen a debate, when nobody's really had the opportunity to make their case or talk, so America can gauge whether or not we like them or not, I just think it's too early. I think that there is some value in the polls to see where we're at, but at the same time, it's really early, and you shouldn't put too much stock into polls just yet, because we could see Joe Biden have the same effect that Hillary Clinton had, since he will be viewed probably as an establishment figure. I mean, he is establishment, but I don't know that he's going to be perceived that way among the American people. But what happened to Hillary could happen to him, in that the more he talks, the more his poll numbers go down. We don't know yet. I think that Joe Biden is probably a little bit more politically astute than Hillary Clinton, so odds are they won't go down too much, but at the same time, polling is just, it's too early at this point to put too much stock in it. But if you're desperate and you're a member of the establishment and you hate Bernie Sanders, then you're going to grasp onto anything that might potentially give you hope that he's going to lose. Now, when it comes to the next criticism, people say, we can't elect Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders is too white. In fact, Amy Siskin, a journalist, said that she's not voting for a white male in the Democratic Party primary. And it's not just that people are averse to having a white male be president. It's that the establishment is trying to perpetuate this myth that Bernie Sanders just doesn't do too well among black voters. Now, Mehdi explains that this narrative that is accepted by the mainstream media, that Sanders didn't perform well among blacks, is actually an oversimplification, because in actuality, he only really failed to capture support among older black voters, and he didn't actually struggle that much among younger black voters. Furthermore, he makes the point that there are dozens of prominent black supporters and surrogates of Bernie Sanders that align with him, and furthermore, he's since broadened his support among people of color since 2016, and he's done this by building alliances within the black community and aligning with high-profile black candidates such as Andrew Gillum. And additionally, what he's doing seems to be working, seeing that various polls now show that Bernie Sanders actually has the highest approval rating among black voters. So at this point, they're basically just trying to rehash the Bernie bro myth that is no longer backed up by the data. Now, when it comes to Bernie Sanders being too old, I actually really liked the way that Mehdi responded to this argument here, because for some reason, there was this idea that progressives didn't want Nancy Pelosi to be the speaker because we were ageist and not against her corporatism. Now, nobody really said that. I don't care how old someone is, so long as they're going to do a good job and promote progressive policies. But the idea was that progressives are against Nancy Pelosi because, well, she's too old. Now, Mehdi's going to take that argument, flip it, and use it against the establishment. He says, come election day, November 2020, Sanders will be 79 years old, which would make him the oldest person to ever run for the White House. Yet, his likely Republican opponent, Trump, will be the previous record holder. He was 70 in 2016 and will be 74 in 2020. Yes, the overweight, sitting president who eats junk food, doesn't exercise, and refuses to release his medical records. In terms of the Democratic primaries, Sanders will be 79 in 2020, but Biden will be 77, and Elizabeth Warren will be 71. Oh, and did you know that Speaker-designate Nancy Pelosi and her top deputy, Steny Hoyer, are both older than the Vermont senator? So why should his age be held against him? I think that is a perfect response, and one thing I'd add is that Bernie Sanders is seemingly in perfect health. There's been no indication that he's in poor health. He is traveling the country. The guy has more energy than me. So I'm confident that Bernie Sanders will be fine, and furthermore, even if Bernie Sanders was in poor health, if that were the case, hypothetically speaking, well, then if he picked a VP that would carry on his legacy, then that would kind of ameliorate that fear. So I think that that's a perfect response. Now, also, there's the argument that we all know and love from among the progressive left. Bernie's not a Democrat. Now, to that, this is how Mehdi responds. So what? Pretty much. He may be an independent, but he caucuses with Senate Democrats and is their chair of outreach. He won 13 million votes in the 2016 Democratic primaries. Despite refusing to join the Democrats in the wake of the 2016 election, the party's base still adores him. As of October 2018, he had a whopping 78% approval rating with Democratic voters. That's a phenomenal point. I'd also add, though, to Mehdi's argument here, that him not being a Democrat actually gives him a benefit, because if you look at public opinion polls, a lot of people aren't satisfied with the two-party duopoly. More people identify as independents than they do with either of the two parties. So Bernie Sanders being an independent is actually going to help him out quite a bit. Now, certainly if he runs within the Democratic Party primary and he accepts their nomination, then he'll no longer be a Democrat, but the fact remains that he's been an independent throughout his career, and that's going to give him an advantage. It's not going to be a hindrance. So I don't even know why people in mainstream media and within the establishment and DC bubble think that that's persuasive to normal Americans, but it's not. To them, it's persuasive because they're Democratic Party loyalists and they just can't fathom that someone wouldn't be loyal to their party. But that's just tribalism. What Bernie Sanders represents is individual people, so who cares what party he's a part of? Now, finally, we get to the last argument, and that argument is that, but Bernie's a socialist. We can't nominate a socialist because that would be disastrous. Now, what Mehdi says about this is that while that's probably not going to hurt Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party primary, it could conceivably hurt him at least a little bit in the general election when going up against Donald Trump, and the Republican Party tries to throw the entire kitchen sink at Bernie Sanders. But Mehdi has a response to that I think is actually very persuasive. It's that for the last 8 years when Obama was president, what did Republicans call him? They called him a socialist, when Obama was everything but a socialist. He was a neoliberal who almost exclusively proposed market-based solutions to political problems. And I think that voters will be able to realize that since Republicans overused that word so much, they've essentially stripped it of all meaning, and that word doesn't really have any meaning anymore, at least among the Republican base, because nobody even knows what that means, since Republicans basically just use it to demonize any and everyone that they don't like. Now, I agree with Mehdi for the most part, but I do believe he's overstating the threat that, that socialist scare will have in the general election, because you have to think about it this way. We are living at a time where Americans are incredibly polarized. You have people on the left and center, and then you have people on the far right. Anyone who's a conservative in the modern Republican Party and identifies with them, they're on the far right. So we're polarized. So there's very few people in the middle of those two groups who is going to, for some reason, be turned off by that socialist label and flip and go to the far right. I think it's conceivable, sure, it could happen, but those types of voters don't really exist, and they won't exist in 2020. I'd be surprised if they did. You're either to the left or you are far right, and I don't really think that socialist label is going to be enough to turn you off so that way you vote for a fascist like Donald Trump. Furthermore, Bernie Sanders has the ability, like Obama, to excite the base, which is often a determining factor in the Democratic Party's success. In fact, it's always a determining factor in elections. And on top of that, polls from 2016 showed that Bernie Sanders would have defeated Donald Trump handily. And while we don't know how he'd fare against Trump now, well, it does tell us that while they may not like socialism, even if they may be against the idea of socialism, the abstract idea of socialism, well, they'd still be willing to opt for Bernie over Donald Trump based on older polls. And furthermore, when you put a face to a certain set of political ideas, it kind of makes it less scary. And furthermore, we have to remember that most voters, they self-identify as conservative, but operationally speaking, they're liberal. So just because somebody feels as if they are symbolically conservative doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be conservative in practice. And I think the same is true here. Just because somebody says they wouldn't vote for a socialist, if a majority of people say they wouldn't vote for a socialist, doesn't mean in practice that they wouldn't vote for a socialist if they know who that socialist is and what he or she stands for. And furthermore, Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in America. So while Americans in general might be inherently averse to the idea of socialism, I think that attaching a face to it, I theorize at least, would dissipate any fears that they have. And furthermore, Bernie Sanders isn't even a real socialist. He's a social democrat. He calls himself a democratic socialist, but in actuality, he's a social democrat. A social democrat is basically a capitalist who wants to make capitalism a little bit more softer around the edges. So I think that would be relatively easy for us to combat. And when he talks about socialism, he talks about policies like Social Security, Medicare for All, which are policies that are overwhelmingly popular. So I don't actually think it's going to be that big of a problem. And I kind of disagree with Mehdi here because I think he's overstating the threat that socialist label poses to Bernie Sanders. But with that being said, after looking at all of these main criticisms, I think these are the 5 main criticisms, at least now in December of 2018. I mean, if this is the best that the establishment can come up with, then I think we should all feel relatively confident going into 2019. I mean, don't feel comfortable because you never want to get too comfortable. We've still got to work hard, but for the most part, if this is the best that they got, that they can throw at Bernie Sanders, I'm glad that Mehdi Hassan wrote this article because I do think that we need to start thinking about ways we're going to respond to all of these criticisms because they will inevitably be used against Bernie Sanders. And if we craft responses now, I think we'll be better off if we all kind of say the same thing because these are persuasive counter arguments to use against the most prominent criticisms of Bernie. So yeah, these aren't very persuasive in my opinion. So I think that we can easily rebut these, but we still got to work hard, and that goes without saying.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.